I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. Not in a million years. I mean, school lockdowns were just drills, right? We'd practice them a few times a year, the usual routine. Teachers would lock the doors, we'd all huddle in a corner, and they'd tell us it was just practice. But this time, it was different. The fear in our teacher's eyes said it all. It was real. It all began on a gloomy Friday morning. The rain was pelting against the classroom windows, creating a rhythmic drumming that provided an eerie backdrop to our mundane history lesson. I had just started to drift into my own world, daydreaming about the weekend ahead, when the loudspeaker crackled to life. "Attention, students and staff." Principal Wilson's voice echoed through the room, filled with an unusual tension. "This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. Lockdown procedures are now in effect." For a moment, my brain couldn't process what I had just heard. Lockdown, not a drill. The class fell silent as our teacher, Mrs. Reynolds, rushed to the door and locked it. The sharp click of the lock sent a shiver down my spine. "Okay, everyone, get to the corner, away from the windows," she said, her voice trembling. "And be as quiet as possible." I followed the rest of the class to the designated corner, my heart pounding in my chest. The only sound was the relentless rain outside, and the murmur of worried voices, all of us wondering the same thing. What was happening? My mind raced, filled with thoughts of all the terrible things that could be causing this lockdown. I glanced around at my classmates, their faces etched with fear and confusion. I'd never seen them like this before. There was Jake, who always had a joke ready, now pale and trembling, and Emily, who was normally the confident one, was holding her breath like the rest of us. We waited, huddled together, for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Mrs. Reynolds had her phone out, trying to get updates, but the Wi-Fi signal was down, and the cell reception was weak. The silence was deafening. All I could think about was the what-ifs. What if this was a school shooter? What if they found us? What if we didn't make it out of here alive? The fear was suffocating, and I just wanted to be anywhere but there. Then there was a faint sound, distant, but growing louder. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate. My heart raced, and I could hear the thud of each beat in my chest. Mrs. Reynolds motioned for us to stay silent as she held her phone up to her ear, desperately trying to get some information. The footsteps grew closer, and my breath caught in my throat. This was it. The moment I realized I was trapped in a nightmare. I could feel the tension in the room, the shared terror that bound us all together. And then, the door handle jiggled. My heart was in my throat as I watched the doorknob turn slowly. The door was locked, but I knew that wouldn't keep someone determined out for long. Mrs. Reynolds was on the phone, whispering for help, but there was no response. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the creeping fear that was crawling through me. The footsteps stopped just outside our door. I could hear the heavy breathing of someone on the other side, and the faintest whisper of a voice, too low to make out any words. I wasn't sure if we were about to face the unimaginable, but then, as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps retreated. They faded away into the distance, and we were left in the eerie silence once again. I felt a mix of relief and confusion. Who had been outside our door? What did they want? And why did they leave without entering the room? I needed answers, but the phone call with Mrs. Reynolds had been fruitless. We remained huddled in that corner, listening to the rain and the sound of our own racing hearts. Time passed like a blur, and I kept thinking about my family, my friends, and all the things I'd taken for granted. It was like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating my hope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the intercom crackled to life once more. Principal Wilson's voice came through, shaky but determined. "The threat has been neutralized," he announced. "You may now exit your classrooms." The relief that washed over me was indescribable. We unlocked the door and cautiously stepped out, the hallway echoing with the sound of hushed conversations. As I made my way to my next class, I couldn't help but wonder about the person who had been outside our door. What had their intentions been, and why had they left? The mystery lingered, but I was just grateful to be alive and reunited with my classmates. I've learned something that day, something that goes beyond textbooks and history lessons. I've learned that life can take the darkest, most unexpected turns, and when it does, all you can do is hold on, survive, and be grateful for every precious moment. This wasn't a story I ever expected to tell, but it's one that reminds me that we can endure and overcome even the most terrifying of situations. I never thought I'd be the one trapped outside when the nightmare began. Let me tell you, it was a rainy Tuesday morning, and as I rushed towards the school entrance, I couldn't help but feel the weight of my backpack, loaded with unfinished homework and a sandwich hastily thrown together. The drizzle soaked my hoodie as I scurried across the parking lot. The bell had just rung, signaling the start of another monotonous school day. As I reached the entrance, the heavy metal doors felt unusually cold beneath my clammy fingers. But I paid it no mind. After all, what could possibly go wrong on an ordinary school day? I stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the sound of my sneakers echoing through the empty corridors. The lockers lined the walls, silent sentinels guarding the secrets and stories of countless students. I was just about to round the corner to my first class when a loud, jarring alarm cut through the air. My heart leaped into my throat, and I froze, panic instantly flooding my veins. I'd never heard that alarm before, and from the stricken faces of the few students scattered around me, it was clear they hadn't either. "What's going on?" I muttered to a girl clutching her books nearby. She just shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. In a split second, the voice of our principal, Mr. Thompson, crackled through the intercom. His usually composed voice was strained. "Attention, students and staff. We are initiating a lockdown. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. Find a classroom, lock the doors, and hide. Do not open them for anyone until further notice." My heart was now pounding so loudly in my chest that I could hardly hear my own thoughts. A lockdown? But why? How? We'd practiced these drills, but this was the real deal. I had no choice but to scramble toward the nearest classroom, the heavy dread sinking into my stomach. The classroom door was just inches away when it slammed shut right before my eyes. I had been too slow, too late. My heart was now in a full-on sprint, and I banged on the door, frantic and desperate, my voice trembling as I begged. "Let me in. Please let me in." Inside, through the small glass window on the door, I saw Mrs. Henderson, my English teacher, her eyes brimming with tears. She seemed torn, wanting to help but trapped by the fear and uncertainty that had gripped us all. "I'm sorry," she mouthed through the glass, then disappeared from sight as she joined the others in the corner of the classroom. I was alone in the hallway. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave. Where could I hide? What could I do? The seconds ticked away like hours, and I couldn't shake the image of whatever had triggered this lockdown, bursting through the exit door. A moment of clarity pierced the fog of my fear, and I sprinted to the nearest restroom. The sound of the rain outside was deafening, providing the perfect cover for my frantic sobs as I crouched in a stall, huddled against the cold tile floor. I waited, my breath racked, for what felt like an eternity. I could hear faint, muffled voices and footsteps in the hallway. My mind raced with horrifying possibilities. Was there an intruder in the school? Someone with a weapon? Were my friends and teachers safe? The minutes turned to hours, or so it felt, my sense of time unraveling. And then the footsteps grew louder, heavier. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. They were approaching the restroom. The entrance door creaked open, and I could hear someone entering. The sound of their footsteps, slow and deliberate, sent shivers down my spine. It was as if my whole life had led to this moment, this unbearable silence in a bathroom stall, waiting for a threat that could be lurking just outside. The footsteps moved closer, echoing off the cold tiles, then stopped right in front of my stall. My mind was a whirlwind of terror, my breath shallow, my heart a relentless drumbeat. I had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed, and so certain that my life was about to end. In the cramped space beneath the stall door, I saw the shadow of someone's shoes. They were standing right there, just inches away. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to make a sound, to do something, but I was paralyzed by fear. And then inexplicably, the footsteps moved away, receding back into the hallway. I remained frozen, waiting for some indication that the danger had passed. Minutes dragged on, and finally, I summoned the courage to open the stall door just a crack. The hallway was empty. There was no sign of the intruder. I stumbled out of the restroom, my legs like jelly, and made my way to the nearest classroom door, where Mrs. Henderson had turned to the window. She gasped when she saw me. "You're okay," she said, relief washing over her face. Thank goodness. I collapsed into a desk, my body trembling with the realization that I had narrowly escaped whatever horror had unfolded in the hallways. The lockdown continued for what felt like an eternity, but eventually, the intercom crackled to life once more. "The threat has been neutralized," Mr. Thompson announced. "You may now exit your classrooms." As the classroom door swung open, my classmates and I spilled out into the hallway, our faces marked by a mixture of fear and relief. I clung to my friends, feeling the warmth of their presence and the reality of our shared survival. I can't explain the terror I felt that day, being locked out during a school lockdown, but I can tell you that I'm grateful to be here, telling the tale. And I've learned that life can change in an instant, and sometimes you find strength and resilience in the most unexpected of places, like a restroom stall. You know, there's something incredibly eerie about the moment a school day begins. The quiet halls, the smell of freshly waxed floors, and the anticipatory buzz of students heading to their classrooms. It's a kind of quiet hopefulness, like a blank canvas waiting to be painted with knowledge. But there was one day when that hopefulness gave way to sheer terror. It all started just like any other day. I shuffled into my high school, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes half open. It was a Wednesday, which meant I was already wishing it was Friday. The familiar drone of early morning chatter filled the air, punctuated by the occasional laughter and the slam of lockers. But this particular Wednesday would turn out to be unlike any other. As I stumbled to board my first class, the bell rang, and I knew I was cutting it close. I quickened my pace, reaching the classroom door just as it closed behind me. I was out of breath, and a small, apologetic smile was all I could manage when Mrs. Thompson, my English teacher, gave me an exasperated look. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. But then, everything changed. An ear-piercing alarm blared throughout the building. I could see the confusion in Mrs. Thompson's eyes, and it mirrored the bewildered expressions on my classmates' faces. That wasn't the fire alarm, the tornado alarm, or even the intruder drill. It was something entirely different, something I'd never heard before. "Attention, students and staff," came the crackling voice over the loudspeakers. It was Mr. Smith, our principal, but he sounded off. "This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. Lockdown procedures are in effect. Find a secure location and lock all doors." Panic set in instantly. This wasn't a drill. What was happening? The class leaped into action, rushing to the windows to pull the blinds and locking the door. I scanned the room for a good place to hide. The closet, too obvious, behind the teacher's desk. No, they'd look there first. While my classmates found their spots, I decided to hide under a table at the back of the room. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best I could come up with in the heat of the moment. I slid under, trying to control my shaky breath. The sound of my heartbeat filled my ears. The minutes crept by like hours, and all I could do was wait. I couldn't help but let my mind wander into terrifying territory. What was this threat? Who was behind it? My imagination conjured up horrific scenarios, and I was paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Heavy, uneven steps that seemed to echo in the silence. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle my own panicked breathing. The steps grew louder, closer, until they finally reached the classroom door. The doorknob jiggled, and my heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I thought about all the things I'd never get to do: graduate, go to college, see the world. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the door stopped shaking and the footsteps retreated. My classmates and I collectively held our breath, waiting for another sign of danger. Time dragged on, and I was consumed by my own fear. Then Mr. Smith's voice came over the intercom once more. "The threat has been neutralized. It is safe to exit your classrooms." We all stared at each other, disbelief etched on our faces. Slowly, we unlocked the classroom door and stepped into the hallway. Teachers and students poured out of other classrooms, their eyes wild with fear. Some were crying, others hugging each other tightly. It was as though we'd all survived a catastrophe. I tried to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing added up. The hallway seemed different, the air heavy with an unshakable dread. As I joined the disoriented crowd, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. And then I saw him. Principal Smith stood at the end of the hallway, his eyes wide, his suit disheveled. He was talking to a police officer, but the words were lost in the chaos around me. I felt a strange pull, a need to approach them. As I got closer, I heard fragments of their conversation. "No one saw him," the police officer was saying. "It's like he disappeared into thin air." "I can't explain it," Mr. Smith replied. "He was here one moment, and then he just vanished." My heart dropped. The description they were giving fit the intruder, the person who had tried to enter our classroom. But I hadn't seen anyone else in that hallway. And then it hit me. I was the last one to enter the classroom. What if they were talking about me? I approached Mr. Smith and the police officer, my voice quivering as I asked, "What happened? Who were you looking for?" They both turned to me, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock. "We were looking for the intruder," the police officer said. "The one who tried to get into your classroom. We had no idea where he went." My heart raced and my mind spun. I realized that, somehow, in my haste to get to class, I had become the threat. I had been the one trying to get into the classroom, my classmates locked away in fear, thinking someone was trying to harm them. The realization washed over me like a wave of ice-cold dread. I was the cause of the lockdown, the source of the terror that had gripped the entire school. The guilt and shame flooded my veins, and I stood there, feeling like a monster in the midst of the chaos I had unknowingly created. It was a nightmare that I would never forget, one that would haunt me for the rest of my days. In the end, I learned that sometimes the real horror isn't a faceless threat in the shadows, but the darkness that can reside within ourselves. And it's a darkness that can turn an ordinary school day into a nightmare beyond imagination.